All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Delivery Exception. This is a short speaker series we've organized for this spring to bring together scholars and organizers to discuss logistical justice and the possibilities of reconciliation in an era of supply chain capitalism. This event, which is free and open to the public, is also organized as part of the Supply Studies Research Network, a group of scholars, students, activists, and organizers who have identified an active interest in the critical study of logistics. With the research network itself supported in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities Office of Digital Humanities. Funding and additional support for this series is provided by the Conference of Arts and Science Deans and the Department of Communication and Media Studies here at Fordham. And while as a virtual event, the geographies that are being enrolled in our assembly here today are many, I'd like to acknowledge that Fordham itself occupies the ancestral lands of the Lenni, Lenape, and Wappinger peoples. Before I introduce our speakers for today, I'd just like to go ahead and do the schedule for the rest of our events this spring. So our next event is Wednesday, March 6th at 7 p.m. With Christina Dunbar-Hester from the University of Southern California and Athena Tan from Plugin IE. That IE is Inland Empire. Monday, March 18th at 6 p.m. we have Miriam Posner from the University of California, Los Angeles. And then Wednesday, March 27th at 6 p.m., we have Benjamin McKean from Ohio State University, Jessica Champagne from the Worker Rights Consortium, and Angeles Solis from Make the Road Action. So I hope to see you at some of these future events. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers. The title of their presentation today is Justice at the End of the Supply Chain, Interrogating Amazon's Logistical Urbanism from the Cloud to the Curb. Our speakers are Armin Beverungen, Ulf Treger, and Maja-Lee Voigt. Armin is a junior professor for organization and digital cultures at Leuphana University Lundberg, where he is also a member of the Center for Digital Cultures. He's an associate editor of organization, and his research currently focuses on two projects on how Amazon reshapes our cities, and that's with a particular focus on automation, logistics, and speculation in the city, and on the promises of wealth associated with smart urbanism. Ulf Treger is fellow with the Center for Digital Cultures and associated with the project Automating the Logistical City. He has studied visual communication at HFBK Hamburg. As a designer, coder, and researcher, he works on projects on the interdependence of digital and physical spheres and researches their impact on social practices and public space. One focus are maps as visual representations of space and also as instruments of creating spaces. Maja-Lee Voigt is an urban researcher, PhD student at the Leuphana University Lundberg, and co-founder of the Interdisciplinary City Research Collective. I'm going to do the translation into English, which is, I think, Actors for Urban Disobedience in Hamburg, Germany, assisted by a methodological toolbox of ethnographic and critical feminist thinking. She is currently researching Amazon's monopoly on bits, bytes, and boxes. Overall, Maja-Lee's work focuses on the automation of logistical cities, tackling questions about resisting algorithmic architectures of oppression and hacking patriarchy towards more just urban futures. So welcome to you all. Thanks so much for being here. And I'll go ahead and hand it off to you. Attendees, we have time for questions afterwards. You can either paste your question as we go in the Q&A button at the bottom of Zoom, and we'll answer it afterwards. Or after the speakers are done, you can go ahead and raise your hands, and I will call on you, and I can activate your microphone to allow you, if you want, to speak your question. You're welcome to also type it into chat or in that Q&A panel. So without further ado, please go ahead.
Yeah, hello and welcome also from from us. It's a pleasure to be part of this wonderful set of speakers and it's part of the series. Thanks for having us, Matthew. And it's fun to be part of the network. And it's been actually quite a joy to put together this presentation that should take us the next 45, 50 minutes or so. Yeah, we've already been introduced, so I'll start off with giving you a bit of a background to where this all comes from. And the background is really a research project on automating the logistical city. This is the front page of our website. And we're concerned in that project with studying how logistics and its algorithms transform urban spaces and turn them into sites of ordinary speculation. So a particular focus of the project is on Amazon, as you would have spotted already, which we think has been granted too little attention as a force really remaking the urban beyond the impact of its search for new headquarters, the building of signature skylines, or more broadly, the decline of retail and the rise of delivery. And we really spent the last 2 years attempting different inroads into studying Amazon and its impact on the urban, focused in particular on Hamburg and on the Ruhr. Is that okay, presentation? Which you can see on the next slide, just so you know where we are in Germany. So this is a bit of a different story, I guess, a bit of a different narrative perhaps from what you're used to if you're based in the US or in other places. And we've understood this work as an attempt to open up the black box that Amazon largely still is, starting from the premise that our methods will largely involve workarounds, as Amazon is not likely to welcome our research efforts with open doors. We've had, I think, 3 interviews with Amazon reps, and that's about it. So this kind of turned out to be true. And instead, we've deployed a multiplicity of methods to come to grips with how Amazon shapes the city. Our research is focused mainly on 2 empirical sites, as I mentioned. So Hamburg is a city in northern Germany dominated by its large port and media industry. And the Ruhr area is a post-industrial area which has embraced logistics after the decline of the coal and steel industry. And we've complemented this regional focus with broader research into Amazon's platform infrastructures for delivery, also in its relation to Amazon Web Services, as the tech stack, if you like, for much of its operations. Our research included things like fulfillment center and port tours, visits of Amazon sites from fulfillment centers to delivery stations to Amazon lockers, and attempts to map how these infrastructures of logistics have impacted the city. It is also included in a kind of a science and technology studies register, studying patterns and exploring Amazon science blogs and activities such as its last mile routing research shows that Ulf will talk about. And of course, there's been loads of interviews with some Amazon reps, labor union organizers, and other experts working in and around urban logistics. And overall, this multi-method research has produced a very patchy, still, insight into Amazon urbanism, which we would like to present today in 3 parts. I will start mostly talking about labor, questions of justice in relation to labor. Ulf will continue with talking about algorithms and algorithmic justice. And Maja-Lee will conclude talking about space and spatial justice. And of course, these are highly related, and we'll point out some of those connections. And we will each start with a little vignette from the field to give you a bit of a feel of our research. It needs to be said that Ilya Antonucci, our colleague on the project, unfortunately can't be with us today. But if you're watching this later, hello, Ilya. Okay. So I'll start now with a quick field note from Amazon. I'll just read this out. So this is from a field trip to a location in Dortmund last September that I did with our colleague Andrea Pollio, who's based in Turin. And I think you can put the next slide already. We've taken the route through the main entrance of the old Westfalenhütte, situated northeast of Dortmund city center, passing underneath a railway bridge still emblazoned with ThyssenKrupp steel in large letters. The site used to be one of the largest steel plants in the world until its decline in the 1990s and the dismantling of the sintering plant and other parts, which after 2002 were sold and shipped to Xinjiang in China to be rebuilt there. Now only one steel coating plant and one rolling mill are left, and otherwise the vast site has been redeveloped to mostly host logistical enterprises. These include 2 Amazon fulfillment centers, one of them Amazon's first what they call inbound cross dock in Europe, through which used to pass more than half of all goods sold by Amazon in Europe until more of the same type of fulfillment center were established elsewhere. But we're not here for the fulfillment center. Instead, we're here to investigate reports of a new Amazon delivery station, which was meant to have opened already a year ago at the end of 2022. We approached the 2 new vast logistics halls, which stand in an 80-degree angle to each other, built and owned by the logistics property developer Prologis. So you can see them kind of between the two railway lines in the top right there. Those are the two top ones there, if you can make out where they are. The business sign next to the entrance lists one tenant for the second hall, Amazon DNZ3. As we continue up the driveway, we're greeted by dozens and dozens of Teslas, however, some of which have QR codes attached to their windows, which with the prompt, "You can buy me." Apparently, the other hall has been turned into an ad hoc Tesla delivery hub, a small hut at the entrance gates to the parking welcoming potential buyers. As we turn right on the parking lot, we notice that the near end of the second hall seems completely empty. All loading bays are shuttered closed, and there are no logos on the side of the hall except for Prologus. As we drive further down the vast lot, we encounter a sign that announces Amazon DNZ3. Yet the parking lot is eerily empty until we notice that the last loading bay of the hall is half open with a Volkswagen Golf parked in front of it. Next to it, at the very end of the hall, there's a recreation area where it seems someone is taking a break. We leave the car, check out the bike stand, and survey the area. Directly next to the parking lot, a newly created bike lane leads back to the Nordstadt, the northern part of Dortmund, where traditionally workers at the steel plants used to live, and today still migrants arrive and find their footing in this multicultural city. The parking lot, as well as the loading area in front of the gate, seem hardly used. There are no tire marks on the concrete, except presumably from a few joyriders circling around with screeching tires at night. We approach the 6 men, most of whom are playing table tennis. One of them sat on the backrest of a bench smoking. We're told that they're the engineering team dismantling the equipment from the delivery station. Apparently, the station was all set up for operations a year ago, but then was never put to use. The team is now dismantling and packing up the equipment to be shipped somewhere near Bremen, perhaps Oldenburg in the north of Germany, where we later found out a new delivery station is to open soon. Go to the next slide. So that was the field note. So this field note from a visit to the site in Dortmund documents in some ways how speculative Amazon's development in its last mile delivery network is. It quickly opened a lot of delivery stations and then noticed it had excess capacity, leading to it not even opening some of the stations. It also alludes to the kinds of spaces Amazon enters as it develops its logistical infrastructure, including in the case of Dortmund and many others, a post-industrial site in close proximity to a neighborhood with loads of migrant labor. Amazon's fulfillment centers are well established in Germany, which is Amazon's second largest market worldwide. And what is more recent, though, is its venturing into last mile delivery, with heavy expansion taking place since 2017. And it has since started operating more than 70 delivery stations where parcels are sorted for delivery to homes. In the beginning, it relied quite heavily on Amazon Flex, so on self-employed labor, where the key skill required is a driving license, and which can be scaled up very quickly and complement more firm labor relations to kind of fill up holes, and especially for kind of late night delivery. However, Amazon shut down Amazon Flex in Germany in the summer of 2022 and now relies pretty much solely on subcontractors, so-called delivery service partners, to complete their last mile. On the right here, you can see a graphic by Maja-Lee, which shows you how this works, how you go from fulfillment centers to sometimes sorting centers, not always, and then the trucks arrive at the distribution centers where things are sorted for final delivery before the vans hit the road and bring us our parcels with a smile. Next slide, please. To understand labor at Amazon, which is what I'm supposed to be talking about, we need to acknowledge the different kinds of labor and employment relations that Amazon employs. So this will be perhaps familiar to you, but I thought I'd run through it anyway. Amazon deploys these different ways of including labor in its logistical operations. The situation in fulfillment centers, I think, is well documented. So for setup, Amazon often relies on temporary work agencies in Germany and elsewhere who provide kind of the first batch of labor. There's usually then a transition towards contracts with Amazon, often starting as seasonal labor in advance of the Christmas period. And this comes with the promise of being offered a permanent contract, which is, of course, often broken as people are made redundant on the day before Christmas. But those who are allowed to stay on remain on the maximum possible probationary period of 2 years before they finally get a safe permanent contract. For last mile delivery, though, Amazon relied somewhat on Amazon Flex, as I said, a scalable self-employed labor, but now relies pretty much completely on subcontracted labor employed by these delivery service partners. And this effectively means that Amazon can delegate responsibility for labor relations in the last mile while effectively imposing its contracts. So delivery service partners apply to Amazon and must conform to Amazon's conditions, for example, in relation to the availability of backup drivers or making themselves available for, contact, even sitting in these stations during the day as they're monitoring the drivers. That's the only way they can be actually part of this delivery service partner program. Especially what they call the DSP 2.0 model involves partners working exclusively for Amazon. So they're really very dependent on them. There's so much to say about labor at Amazon, labor relations. I just wanted to pick up two things that became very obvious in working through, looking at the fulfillment centers, but then also the delivery stations and the last mile. The first one is algorithmic integration, which is the next slide. And what's kind of interesting here is that the kinds of algorithmic management taking place in fulfillment centers, which are well documented, are also kind of spread beyond. So you may know Alessandro Del Fanti's work, for example, who writing about the fulfillment centers has noticed that we have this, something he calls machinic dispossession, which is when you have this chaotic storage where stuff is just put all over the fulfillment center. Nobody knows where stuff is, only the machine knows. And this is kind of this, he calls it machinic dispossession to note how, it withdraws the ability to actually control our work environment. And we also have documentation of all these forms of surveillance. So not so much visual surveillance as data surveillance and capture, which Del Fanti calls a kind of augmented despotism, because it really leaves you subject to all sorts of managerial prerogative and random prerogative. What's startling about delivery labor is how it is equally tightly integrated. So in a fulfillment center, it's obvious maybe because you're in this building that Amazon made to control your labor. But it also works in pretty much the same way when you deliver for Amazon. So the Flex app, which is the ones that self-employed drivers use, is also actually one that all the other drivers for the delivery service partners use. So the apps both provides information on shifts or the blocks that that drivers are assigned to, and it also provides routing and navigation information. And of course, all of this is very tightly used to monitor performance. So there's little scope here for decision-making by drivers in the same way it is in the fulfillment center, I'd say. And the routing is calculated centrally. So this actually happens for all of Europe, even in one kind of operation center in Barcelona, as one of the interviews that Maja-Lee interviewed told us. And drivers must adhere to the routes and to the order of delivery, which is provided in that way, because this is what machine learning wants. Otherwise, the machines can't learn. What you see here on the slide is a dashboard for delivery service partners, and this is how both Amazon and the delivery service partners track drivers. So this is from a video on YouTube. We didn't get an insight into the software, but it's fairly obvious that this is how kind of GPS tracking works, where all of the drivers when they use their apps are trackable very quickly, and it means that the delivery service partners. Next slide, please. So that's the one thing that's maybe worth mentioning, this kind of algorithmic management that spreads from the fulfillment center to the delivery station and to the road. The other thing is abstract localism. I don't know, we haven't really found a better term for it yet. We haven't thought about a better one. And this is this weird way in which Amazon clearly has this kind of very standardized managerial techniques that it uses, especially the algorithmic techniques of routing, of surveillance and so on, but also and then also these kind of cultural forms of management, like all of the Amazon principles that you see emblazoned kind of all over the delivery stations and fulfillment centers. But it also does this kind of dealing with kind of the local meaning of labor. So there's just two examples here. One of them on the right is from a sorting station in Witten near Dortmund. And you can see what you see. It says DTM9, the sort center, and then what you see in the middle is the classic pick of the coal miner and the classic helmet of the coal miner with a lamp in front. And of course, this alludes to kind of very, very established traditions of kind of labor, where labor is highly valued. It makes you proud to work. The coal miner used to be very proud, and that this is kind of meant to be transferred to working for Amazon. So it kind of picks up in a very crude way. However, every delivery station gets one of these signs. Tries to pick up on these histories and cultures of labor in order to kind of value labor and motivate staff. And then on the other side, you see this. This is from inside a delivery station in Wuppertal, south of, kind of 50 kilometers south of Dortmund. on diversity. Whenever you walk into any of these places and you watch any of these videos, it's always about how diverse these places are. And of course, that has to do with kind of the migrant labor force that actually works at these places, that have to be kind of motivated to actually embrace the workplace, which is part of its diversity. So this is kind of a response, I think, to local conditions, both in terms of the valuing of labor and the migrant labor force, the diverse migrant labor force. Okay, next slide. And when we think about justice, then, because this is in the title of the of the series, there's so much to say. I just want to point out three things. There's obviously a huge in collective bargaining. There's a huge debate in Germany, and this is interesting compared to the US, that it's all about whether the bargaining, the benchmark is retail or logistics, because in Germany, the logistics collective bargaining agreements are a lot worse than the ones for retail. But Amazon says it's a logistics company here rather than a retail company. So it pays logistics, well, roughly logistics wages, not retail wages. So this has been one of the major ongoing demand from the unions for Amazon to acknowledge as a retailer, and that needs to pay retail wages. There's also all of these kind of outsourcing, subcontracting, self-employment forms of labor relations, which we can call kind of the Amazonification of logistics, which raise loads of questions about, basically Amazon evading all sorts of responsibility for labor relations. There's also a huge problem or challenge to kind of organize last mile, because the unions really aren't getting to the last mile. They get into fulfillment centers, some delivery stations, although they're too new, but they're not really getting to the large labor force, migrant labor force in delivery, which also has a high turnover and is outsourced. So that's kind of a huge, stumbling block when we want to think about justice. And then on the right, you see a poster from an art group called Nobotic. They've been trying to think about data and algorithmic justice, which means I'll now pass on to Ulf to continue.
Thank you. I will also start with a footnote, and I will read it from, I think, a footnote of Maja-Lee. It's HWS Meetup, organized by Moja, July 6, 2023, Hamburg. It's pretty crowded, around 40 to 50 people around here. My neighbors, unfortunately, are just here to meet people and learn more about HWS, Amazon Web Services, so no expert yet. There's free pizza and drinks, dudes with funny t-shirts, some hipsters, classes, white sneakers, one pair of Birkenstocks. Mostly casual clothing. The event is generally in English. I'm 1 out of 3 female representing persons, excluding organizers. No one is taking notes. Barely any pictures are taken of the slides. The Moja location is very stereotypical tech office with a common area including a big screen. Everyone is assembled around it. A big open kitchen area with IKEA-looking lamps out of straws, colorful walls. Everything seems very bright and fun. Big lettering on the bathroom doors. Age of people, mostly in the 20s and 30s. The talk itself is not super beginners friendly, I'd imagine. Lots of specific vocab, but maybe better understandable with the developer background. I wonder if the speakers get any HWS discounts for the talk. I'm thinking no. There are 2 questions during the talk asking about specifics. Some snicker sometimes at the glitches. My neighbor has the Amazon app on his phone. He sells t-shirts and pants and has an online shop. He looks even younger than 20. Maybe he uses fulfillment by Amazon. Yeah, my task, it's the second part of our talk, will be to talk a little bit about our efforts, our recent efforts to scratch a little bit on the black box. I mean, I mentioned it before that like pretty much all large big tech platforms, Amazon is a black box where it's very difficult to take a look inside, especially if you talk about algorithmic control and steering of all the enterprises. Next slide, please. One main theme in the research is mentioned before, to research a little bit more about the last mile, which means from the latest delivery or sorting center to the doorstep of the customers. And our effort was to find out a little bit more how the algorithmic work is controlled and organized around one question, which is here typically cited by a quote of Chris Anderson. Chris Anderson wrote in 2006 this famous book, The Last, not The Last Mile, but The Long Tail, which is kind of like a strategic background description of what Amazon drives up today. And there's one small chapter about logistics. And this chapter has the title of The Tyranny of Geography. And it somehow describes very well the viewpoint of Amazon, of the city, of the last mile, that this is like something that has to be overthrown or competed or conquered and to get under control. Next slide, please. So the basic problems on the perspective of Amazon are that the last mile is extremely time and cost intensive. It contains a lot of uncertainty, the workforce, the workers, the drivers, and the context, of course, the city or the urban context. And therefore, the last mile is probably the last controllable part of the supply chain. Maybe math can help here, and we come back later to some things like traveling salesperson problem who could maybe optimize this problem and help to maximize profit and income. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, it's really difficult to get a view in the black box. We recently tried 3 different approaches, and I would like to roughly show a little bit what we've done. The first example will be that we just wanted to recreate somehow the software that Amazon is using for organizing the whole last mile delivery. And then I will talk a little bit about the Amazon TSP challenge in 2021, and then a kind of like more playful, speculative design of the last mile algorithmic system. Next slide, please. The routing simulation, the idea, since we can't look directly into the black box, is to look out how Amazon is perhaps reusing their own algorithms or the methods that are used in their own algorithms, and how they are perhaps make it accessible for others. And there is Amazon Web Services. We all, I think, know that Amazon Web Services is a really huge cloud and service provider. I think it's getting much more money in the box of Amazon since the delivery itself. And there are some like light versions of the routing algorithms that are used by Amazon itself, sold to the public, monetized in an extra way, without having probably the most comfort and accuracy they're using for themselves. But we thought it would be worth to try out a little bit to use this public available commercial services to find out what is possible with that. So we made a really simple, not really sophisticated application just to find out how the routing and the stuff and the data that comes from that work and how the conditions are of that. Next slide, please. Some preliminary insights are really basic. So we found out that Amazon has a huge universal catalog of places. So every place in the areas where Amazon is active has a hashed ID, and this hashed ID is connected with several data sets of customers, public customers, commercial customers, and also individuals. The routing and maps, which is the interesting stuff from the algorithmic or the mathematical perspective, are provided by external corporations. Here in Northern Hemisphere, it's HERE Technologies or Esri. In Southeast Asia, it's also Crab Maps. Then there's the route optimization, so to calculate the optimal route so that no driver has to drive longer as it's necessary. It's done by a tool which is open source from Google. And and this is the assumption that leads us to the next questions, there might be a lot of real-time updates to inform ahead before the route calculation happens about roadblocks, congestions, any events that might disturb the delivery service. So the question would be also, where does this real-time data comes from? And next slide, please. Here, I just mentioned it, is one of the two main map and routing information provider for Amazon Web Services. And here, Technologies, I don't know if you know this corporation, is owned by 5 to 6 of the largest automotive corporations in the world. For Germany, for example, is Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, and BMW. They bought this corporation from Nokia some years before, and they're running like navigational software for a lot of their cars. And they're also providing the services for others, like in this example for Amazon. And here is practically a little bit more open-minded to talk about their business and about their black box. And they are doing like typical data extravision. So they're getting their real-time data, also the basic data for the place and world index, by just scraping the World Wide Web and to collect every place of interest in information they can collect from the World Wide Web. Next slide, please. The other main data source of here is public data. And in the research, we found a memorandum of understanding of Hamburg, which is one of our 2 places of interest, and where I am staying actually also. And here is a memorandum of understanding from 2017, where the city of Hamburg or the government of Hamburg agreed to share public available data and much more with here, and hope in exchange to get some data from here. Next slide, please. So if you take a look a little bit of this public data from Hamburg, just to mention the background, Hamburg is like every other larger or smaller city struggling with digitalization. There's this construct of smart city or digital city. Hamburg has a really big digital city strategy since 10 years. And they are also like investing a lot of doing and producing data also for strengthening the mobility sector, and to provide public data for new business models, so to quote them, and to startups in the mobility sector. And to make it possible that a digital image of the city can be created and may be accessible for applications and potential users. Next slide, please. So just to give one possible use case, Hamburg is offering with their data in their urban data hub is this prototype, which is called traffic lights data from Hamburg. It's the real-time data of all traffic lights in the downtown area. You can see this visualization. You can see the crossings and the streets who are leading to the crossings. And every street that are approaching to a crossing is the red light. The traffic light is here indicated in red. And of course, green in the other direction if the road is free. And this is just an example how Hamburg is introducing different kind of real-time traffic data that could be used via their open data geo portal. And that could be used also according to the memory of understanding by here. And at the end of their logistical chain, then by Amazon to optimize their routing and their fulfillment. Next slide, please. This was one approach to find out where the data comes from by our simple demo. The other thing what was really interesting is an event that was initiated by Amazon in 2021. It's called the TSP Challenge. TSP stands for the Traveling Salesperson Problem. The Traveling Salesperson Problem is one of the most basic and most interesting mathematical problems, which is discussed and researched since the 1940s. And it's basically the point to optimize routing and logistics. It comes from the idea that a salesperson is going to different cities to sell things. and that this person doesn't want to get in one city more than once. And of course, it wants to have a route that is as efficient as possible. The problem now is TSP. It's quite simple to explain. It's quite simple to calculate if you like have 2, 3, or 10 stops. But it's getting really, really complicated to calculate if you have, for example, 150 stops. This is like the measure. This is mentioned in several interviews with Amazon workers or managers, which is usual for a worker, delivery worker, who has to bring out 150 things. So the problem is exponential growing solutions, and it's really difficult to find an exact solution. Next slide, please. So during the TSP challenge by 2021 by Amazon, the winning team, for example, and many others who are working with the tribal salesperson problem are not trying to get the really perfect, mathematically perfect solution. They're getting, or they're seeking to get a solution that's quite optimal. It's not perfect, but in a reasonable time and with not so much computing power, they are sufficient to get a pretty good example. So they're using heuristics, they're using linear programming and other tools to get in the direction of that. And this is somehow interesting because they are not on the pursuit to make it like really in a mathematical clean way, but like in a rough, more rock and roll way to go into this direction and to find a solution. Next slide, please. And this approach, not to be too accurate, is a community is coming together with the idea that it's really also really efficient to learn from real life examples. So the winner team of the travel salesperson challenge in 2022 started to really deeply investigate in real driving scenarios. And they tried to find out patterns and transported or transformed the patterns into algorithms. And that was the way they won the challenge. So this is like really an interesting experience, like as we learned before from Armin, that algorithmic control of the delivery worker is somehow very intense, but also we all know that the life in the streets in urban areas is full of messiness, of encounters and things that can happen, so that a normal driver still has some possibility to agitate on his own to optimize his working routine. And this research goes in the direction to learn from this pattern and try to translate this into algorithms to somehow can mimic the real life experiences of the drivers. Next slide, please. So we have now the idea to bring all together these experiences, not also from the field research and the excursions to the different centers and watching the last mile activities, and also getting the algorithms somehow explained a little bit more clearly. We put together in a kind of speculative design all the components, all the know-how we put together to get like a little bit clearer picture of that. And just to sum it up here, really in the short time, there are 3 main components of like any software, and especially of this one. These are the inputs, so sensing, for example, I explained earlier, the public data, or using APIs and other formats to get data into the black box. Then there's the processing, the optimization, the traveling salesperson, problem solving, the timeframes, the fleet management, the workforce organization, and so on. And then the outputs, which means basically the rules that the drivers receives via the Amazon Flex app and through other methods. Next slide, please. This is just a small insight into the speculative design, where we try to put together these different threads and experiences and assumptions we're doing to get a little bit a better picture of what's going on. Next slide, please. And still, there are a lot of questions opened. We like to research more deeply the question which data sources are used, how local and temporal constraints are anticipated, static or temporary ones, what is done to prevent failure, react to interferences, and mitigate delays. One hint is a traveling salesperson challenge, to learn from the drivers and from the knowledge, and how this can be translated into algorithms, and how, after all, real-life patterns can be transformed into rules and regulations. Next slide, please. And this is, of course, a question a lot of researchers and scholars are following. There are quite some papers has been released in the last 2 years by scholars in the direction of business studies, and they are like constructing also the picture of a more or less complete model, where you can see here in a really typical constellation in 3 columns. On the left-hand side, there's the demand model, which means the demand of the customers that should be fulfilled. The blue one in the middle is the whole routing problematic, which I explained earlier. And the right side in yellow one is the demand for real-time traffic data to bring the delivery goods as efficient as possible to the customers. Next slide, please. Yeah, and before we come to Maja-Lee's part, I just wanted to wrap up a little bit that I think in terms of justice, there are 2 points I think remarkable. If you go into the direction of algorithmic control of the thing, one thing is where the data comes from. And in this case, for example, if data comes from free and public accessible data sources, the question is, if this is a way we should agree to, or it would be better to regulate this somehow. That would be perhaps a discussion for later. And this the other point of justice would be, of course, that the workforce is exploited not only for the direct work, but also for tracking and learning from the behavior of those people to make smarter algorithms and perhaps in the future to replace them. Thank you.
Yes, so we've heard a little bit of the front end of the logistics that Amazon is operating, and a little bit of the back end, the algorithmic architectures that those logistics are based on, and the data. And I kind of want to give you the bigger picture on what this does to our cities and what we call the logistical city. I do want to start with a field note as well, so bear with me and give you a little bit of an insight into one of the neighborhoods that Armin was already mentioning in Dortmund, which is the Nordstadt, where a lot of workers come from or live, and where Amazon's distribution center there is also based. So this field note of mine is from September 13th of last year. It's a Wednesday around noon, and we're looking for doors. Numerous little leads and interviews, mostly side comments, have led us to the back end of Amazon's logistics, the Nordstadt. A marginalized neighborhood next to Dortmund's logistical park, Westfalenhütte, mostly known for its bad reputation and clinging stigmas. Sometimes also known for its importance in BVB soccer history and its racist cops. The stories are speaking from the posters and stickers on the wall. We're looking for the doors, Tore, literal and metaphorical gateways for gatekeeping practices, and old Werktore, the entryways to the heart and bodily work done at the Hörl factory, for example. Our interview partners kept describing the Nordstadt as a gateway itself, a neighborhood of arrival. Amazon as a door-opening infrastructure from a work perspective is an interesting but controversial point. Although the German working conditions are precarious, exploitative, and temporal, Amazon's jobs are relatively easy gateways to A, get a job without having to speak German, especially because it's English-based, and thus B, ensure a temporary stay within the country, which makes it very attractive to migrant workforce who depends on easy accessible jobs for their visa processes. Albeit it is important to note that Amazon might be a door opener, but it's similarly a gatekeeper. with its culture of hire and fire, extremely hard bodily work in the warehouses, and the always lingering threat that workers might be fired after their probationary period and or when they're politically active in a union, for example. Amazon is strictly controlling their workers, building on an extreme toxic dependency on their jobs within the more vulnerable group of migrant workers. Ironically, also based on the language and local legal knowledge. Is a job at Amazon consequently part of a social migratory infrastructure in a neighborhood such as the Nordstadt, or in Hamburg, the Veddel? What is not merely enough talked about in research about tech, and especially Amazon, we've noticed, is what these infrastructures that we've been talking about in the past, what they have, what kind of impact they have on urban areas and urban ways of life. But if you look closely and follow its logistical traces on your street in front of your door or your favorite kiosk, you come across an intricate web of Amazon infrastructure. In this Amazon town, hold on, the slides aren't working anymore. There you go. In this Amazon town, the halo, this little dot that sleeps next to your bed, is an alarm clock. It tells you about the weather that is outside. It also tracks your vital signs and how you've been sleeping. While you were waking up with the halo, Alexa orders your coffee already, and also your Uber. And while you're going to work, you come across quite a few delivery vans or even robots. Once at work, as Ulf already mentioned, you log into your mostly and probably AWS-based services and interfaces. On your way back home, you kind of pick up your Amazon package at an Amazon locker that is maybe at your favorite kiosk around the corner. And when you arrive at home, your home awaits you with heated, with the right temperature, with your recommended playlist for the evening, and maybe also a filled fridge because Alexa reminded you to go to the grocery shopping. As one of our colleagues, Alison Powell, said within a field trip that we took together, the Amazon infrastructure is quietly, but maybe parasitically, moving into our homes, into our cities, taking up spaces, and taking over already existing infrastructures. So the questions that we have here is, this logistical city that Amazon is creating, who's this run by and who's this run for? So in the next couple of slides, I kind of want to draw a picture of what I call the urban back ends and the urban front ends, what I've already been mentioning and Armin and Ulf have already shown in the particular ways. So I would like to start with the urban back ends. And ironically, the urban back end is where the end of the supply chain begins. And we've seen this in my field note. Those are mostly, or the distribution centers that we're talking about when we talk about the urban back ends and the start of the logistical process that goes into the city and delivers the packages to our doorsteps, is mostly based in neighborhoods that are on the periphery of urban centers, or when they're close to urban centers or in the urban center even, they're mostly marginalized. And we've seen this in the Nordstadt in Dortmund, but we've also seen this at the Veddel in Hamburg, where I'm based. So these peripheries have often not only the problem that they're marginalized in many ways, they don't have enough infrastructure, it's very hard to get there, it's also very hard to get to work there. When you're working for Amazon or if you're delivering for Amazon, they're also very much affected by the pollution of these industries that Amazon is one of. And they also are the place where this very bodily, very hard work of the worker happens. at the same time, we have to say that also the workers not only work there, but mostly also live there. And it's important to say that these neighborhoods thus also kind of operate as gates, and we see one of these gates here, metaphorically, as gates for a migratory community where within these neighborhoods are already existing infrastructures to kind of get work in Germany, get visas. There's knowledge circulating around ways of living and everyday life. Jobs are passed and recommended. And thus, the back end of the Amazon infrastructure is basically built. And it's often invisibilized to the customer since it's at the periphery. And we as customers, or if you're a customer, mostly don't see where this delivery process starts. Here we can see the crowded subway that these backends often hold. And a worker going to work. Also, what we can see is that Amazon is mostly renting spaces. They don't build their spaces. And what is interesting is that they temporarily take over these spaces and then maybe also all of a sudden vanish again. So it's not very, very clear for how long the contracts are running. It's not very transparent who owns these real estate properties. We only see that public infrastructure, like the spaces, the congested streets, the occupied sidewalks, also in an algorithmic way through Amazon Sidewalk, are taken up, are taken over. There's a lot of parking lots and lockers that we see within in the city, and increasingly not in Germany, but in the US, you're probably very familiar with the Amazon supermarkets. So space is a really important bait for Amazon to come to a specific region or city. And even though it is rare, cities go out of their way to attract Amazon to their communities. This goes as much as we've kind of already mentioned. This goes as much as giving out public data or civic data even of the communities in the application processes, for example, for headquarter cities. And I want to quote Dayan here, who says, Amazon got all of the city planning data on the future construction of America for free, as well as bidding information that offered insight as to who might pony up Fed subsidies. That was always the goal for the HQ2 project. And he's referencing their second headquarter project in Arlington that was opened last year. So this takes me to the urban front end and the shiny surfaces of not only privatization, but the big headquarter buildings that we see coming to cities such as Arlington, and in Germany, this would be Berlin, where they have also in the process of opening up a second headquarter for the German-speaking market and country. Ironically, these front ends are for the workers who work on the back end. So for the developers, the programmers, the people mostly that work at AWS. So there's kind of a reverse logic to what we see in spaces. But as I said, Amazon is very much profiting off of free public data and subsidies while being attracted to this community and, being embedded within these communities. So we also see a parasiting or parasitic structure taking over, neighborhoods while maybe gentrifying because they bring a specific white collar workforce to these neighborhoods. And we also see that in Germany, and there's big protest against these tendency to take over spaces and neighborhoods that have previously been very diverse and are now attractive for tech companies that very much bring a very homogeneous group of people to these cities and neighborhoods. Of course, they're also attracted by knowledge clusters. We see this in Germany with universities and research centers. Amazon seems to be very close by to a lot of universities and research centers that focus around robotics, AI, and other interesting sites for them and their infrastructures. But it's also very important to look at the geopolitical notions of where they're setting. So in Arlington, this is very close to Washington, D.C. I don't have to tell you that. So this is a very geopolitically heavy location. Berlin for Germany obviously is the is not only headquarters for Amazon, but also the biggest city and where politics happen. So they also use space to be near these infrastructures, to be near the points where politics are decided upon, to be near to people who have a lot of say in who's shaping spaces, who's shaping societies and politics. So these smooth surfaces hide these gentrification processes that I've been talking about. And Amazon is very much comfortable in settling in these cities also through private-public partnerships that I built, also privatizing of, specific parks or other spaces that we see, and kicking off infrastructure projects, interestingly, like the building of highways, the building of bridges and metro stations. And another tendency that we see behind these shiny surfaces is that cities are increasingly used as test beds, where technologies are prototyped, where things are tried out, where infrastructure that is owned by Amazon, like their supermarkets and laboratories and others, are implemented within the neighborhood, tried out as sort of like a real life lab in a way. So talking about these spatial injustices that I've been pointing to, the question arises, what does this do to a city? And who does that to, basically? What happens to the exciting density of cities, the exciting heterogeneity of cities, where people of different backgrounds get together, negotiate the urban, and build futures that are diverse, plural. And when we look at the Amazon town that I've been painting a picture of, who's represented within these spaces and within the technologies that these spaces hold, who can take part in these infrastructures? What we see is that Amazon is very much trying to establish a controlled and curated public, and does this also through means of convenience and very, very smooth logistics that we barely notice and which vanish in the backgrounds of our conscious, basically. This is a little poster from the how do you say, I don't know, like a movement against Amazon in Berlin. It says save your Kiez, which the Kiez is like the neighborhood, and it's fighting Amazon, basically. So the end of the supply chain is just the beginning. That's what we're arguing. When we look at the end of the supply chain, which supposedly could be our home itself is, again, feeding data into the technologies that are home assistants like Echo or Halo that I mentioned before. So really, we're not talking about a linear supply chain. We're mostly talking about a circular supply chain, because the data is fed back into the processes that, for example, Ulf mentioned, the algorithms. It's learning, it's optimizing these algorithms and, algorithmic architectures, which go back into what Armin was mentioning, the logistics on the ground and the smooth flows that are logistics. And then come to our home and are going back into what we call our everyday lives, and then the cycle pretty much starts again. This is just a little reference to the music group Von wegen Lisbeth. It's a German band who says, "Alexa, please give me back my money," because obviously it's not holding what they promise. So what we want to make clear, to sum it up, is that it's very important to critically question these infrastructures that we've been talking about, but especially the role of big tech companies, not only within, technology studies, within media studies or logistical studies, but also what impact they have on spaces, because space is essential to our everyday lives. Especially in cities, and space represents what social implications we negotiate and live by. So in the light of public infrastructure being more and more and often invisibly influenced by capitalist tech companies such as Amazon, we need to continuously interrogate their authorship, standards, accessibility, and influence on urban everyday life in space. The Amazonification of logistics involves standardized labor regimes with heavy algorithmic integration and soft cultural management. Unionization in delivery is far away, collective bargaining, promising justice even further. And with that, I'd like to close and also say the wrong Amazon is burning. We as researchers feel, or as researchers of Amazon especially, feel like we also have the responsibility to keep the conversation going, to not only open the black box, but make it accessible to not only an academic public, but a public in general. So yes, we want to say, have a look out and maybe question what comes into your home and what you see on the streets, and fight for what you think a future city should look like and be like, with or without technology.
Thank you so much for all of you for that, I think, amazing presentation of, some really, big work, right? I mean, wide-ranging work that's, that feels very large and significant to me. I guess the downside of that is that the target of your inquiry is also very large and, unwieldy in some ways. But does anyone have a question from the audience that they'd like to ask? I have a couple questions, but do you want to? Oh yeah, here. I was going to ask you. There we go. If you would stop sharing your screen, Maja-Lee, but I can make it happen. So we do have a question from IPIE Zoom. I'm going to allow you to ask your question. Go ahead. Whoop. There.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can't see myself. Okay, perfect. Sorry about the Zoom name. This is what happens when you sign in on multiple accounts and don't know which one you're on. My name is Prem. It's good to see you again, Armin. Thank you again for presenting this incredible work. I just had two sort of points of clarification and sort of follow-up questions. One is the what Ulf brought up with regard to the sort of traveling salesman problem and how that's been extended in some of the fleet management sort of technical literature into the vehicle routing problem, and specifically how that has found its way sort of as to address the vehicle routing problem through Google's OR tools. There's some interesting references there in the OR tools literature, specifically about how the distance metric is calculated. And relevant to that, some of the efforts to sort of sort through what you call the messiness of these routes, the route data or the routing data, has in some ways, I think in an interesting way, been handed over to the drivers themselves to make what some of these, for example, apps called routing choices, as in they allow the driver to, like, the driver is given a number of choices about an optimal or efficient route to take to get from point A to point B. And then once they make that choice, that then gets fed back in. So I think that's an interesting point where the sort of apparent choice of agency given to the driver in making the sort of last mile delivery possible is then fed back into the algorithmic sort of systems and the machine learning models that then again optimize for routes and in fact reduce the number of choices. So I thought that was interesting. The other thing I wanted to sort of talk about or like ask about towards the end in Maja-Lee's presentation about the sort of the overarching theme about Amazon's effect on public infrastructure or public space and sort of urban space. Thinking also about how the sort of historical making of the city, of certain spaces, has allowed or made it easier for companies like Amazon and other logistical sort of companies and supply chain companies to enter these spaces and remake them in ways that are conducive to some of the sort of supply chain management and forms of capitalism. How we sort of, with that knowledge, how might we, because there was a note, I think, at the very end about how the difficulties of sort of unionization, collective bargaining, which are well noted, but I think there are also aspects of that that have already resisted some of the same moves that companies previous to Amazon have made in order to try to remake urban space, and how those have been resisted, including, say, anti-gentrification efforts, but a whole lot of other sort of tactics and strategies of resistance, and how we might look to those with the understanding that they can be applicable to resist or change how Amazon is attempting to remake the city. So yeah, thank you.
I'm not sure if I understood your question about the traveling salesperson problem right. Perhaps before that, the OR tools by Google, this is a set of algorithms that uses the heuristics that are well known to get a really almost optimal result. And this could be used by everyone because they are open source. Does that already answered the second half part of the first question?
Sorry, just to clarify, I just wanted to note that the sort of, as you noted, yes, the tools, but I think there is an interesting sort of extension of the traveling salesman problem in the OR tools' approach to the vehicle looting problem, which is more specific to fleet management, that I thought might be just interesting in order to study how some of these rules are constructed based on the decisions or like the live decisions of the drivers themselves.
Yeah.
Send us the material, we'll have a look. Can I answer the middle question, and then Maja-Lee can maybe try the last one? So the stuff about routing and what the drivers are allowed to do not is kind of interesting because, like I was re-looking at some of the material just to clarify, because it's fascinating that the routing challenge says here, here's data on how drivers were driving and clearly not according to an algorithm, and you try to recreate that. And we read that as basically these drivers doing data work that then gets extracted and put into algorithms, so the algorithms become more optimal and not in the way mathematical models would have suggest optimal routes, but taking kind of extracting that knowledge, that knowledge that is local, embodied, and so on. I'm not sure really if there's a kind of a strict kind of one answer to the question of what's the relation between how much liberty these drivers have. My assumption would be that if they do well, they don't get punished, and if they're too slow, they get into trouble. But in any case, they're doing the data work to feed the algorithm to improve the optimization.
Yeah, thank you so much for your comment and question. I think they're very interesting, and we're still trying to tackle those questions as well and finding answers. And as you might know, like research is always starting with questions and ending with even more. So I don't know if I have like one exact answer to your question, but concerning the capitalist cities, where companies have or seem to have more power these days, I think I have to clarify that it is still very different between US cities and German cities. I've seen this on a research trip that I took last year in the US, and I feel like companies have even more power that's just from an outside view in the US, and regional and city politics. That was what I saw on the surface. And also a higher acceptance. We have to say that when we talk about Amazon interfering in cities here, we're questioned a lot because the city is very respected as an institution to run things, and so are regional politics, or even the state that provides most of our essential infrastructure still. So I just want to point out that there are very different perceptions of what I would just casually call the capital city, and what companies can have an influence on those. And in terms of what to do resisting these structures, that's also a very tricky question. And I think what is essential, and what we've seen in New York City, for example, with people rising up against the second headquarters being built there, is that looking in the past, as you said, is super important. Also, exchanging knowledge, generating knowledge around what it does to a city when a company like this comes to your city, it comes to your neighborhood, builds a headquarter there. I think that is very important. So collectively connecting each other, building alliances around the world. And I'm happy to say that I see that globally right now. But it's also important to say that as a citizen of your city, you have a say in what is done. So you can go vote. That's like the most basic one if you're able to vote, which is not always the case. So this is also tricky. But you can go to town hall meetings, you can, comment on the politics that are done. And I do see that that takes a lot of time and also energy and capacities that not everybody has. So this is not very, easily done. But it is a way to kind of get involved and to be critical and to ask questions to what politics are doing and who are they cooperating with and what impact tech companies have within your neighborhood or city.
Yeah, I think reading Armin's comment in the chat, I think Tamara's talk is very on point here in some ways, thinking about these histories of resistance and how we can incorporate them and bring them into the discussions we're having now. Fortunately, I guess, respecting the city is not a problem we have here in the United States in terms of thinking about how a city like New York is handling some of this stuff. But the vehicle routing problem, makes me think of the sort of early kind of UPS algorithm, which was so incredibly simplistic, right? Which was that drivers cannot make left turns. So that it would never route people to make a left turn because on a right turn you could potentially turn during a light, driving the United States, and to go from that to the kind of level of complexity we have now. I mean, people thinking about the public perception of how these systems work, people can understand. Oh yes, I drive. It's easier to make a right turn sometimes than a left turn. I can understand that algorithm. But then you go to the sort of level of complexity that these algorithms have now or will have into the future, and it's almost completely inaccessible to a sort of average person. How these things might work. Are there any other questions from the audience? I have some questions. So I'll ask a question. If anyone would like to ask one, go ahead and raise your hand. But I'll take priority here because I want to think about your work in the context of sort of broader broader work in the critical study of logistics. And I think Armin started immediately by saying, we found some workarounds, because you have to find workarounds. And so my question is about the workarounds. It used to be the case, I guess, thinking as a historian, that some of these companies, companies like Western Electric and Bell, or even IBM, they'd be quite happy to tell you, if you were an academic researcher, exactly how they do things at a certain point in the past. But today, companies like Amazon and other logistics companies are so closed off and inaccessible to us that we have to do, all of these interesting workarounds that appeared throughout all three of your talks, right? Thinking about simulating possible routing because we can't really understand. Amazon's never going to say, here's our system, why don't we route some packages and open that up to us? Finding where the interface for some of these systems, Armin, you showed, a picture of the interface. You said this is from a video, I found, we don't even have access sometimes to what these systems look like, right? The Flex example is also quite an interesting one, because even though Flex has been sort of discontinued, or my local experiences, it's been radically contracted in the sort of amount of use that it has. But we have the Flex interface from when it was super available. That interface, how some of that system works, is still in the hands of Amazon's delivery service partners, right? Because they're in some sense using the same system. So that is yet another sort of workaround and inroad. So just kind of reflecting on your work process so far, what and of course those, I think you said four official interviews that you got, or something like that, right? Kind of on the record interviews with Amazon might contribute some help also. But what have been the sort of most valuable workaround strategies, I guess? Is it just looking through corporate documentation, finding, here's a screenshot in a video? Is it doing this kind of speculative design work, thinking about how to simulate how these processes might work? What is your take on, other researchers who are looking to study these kinds of systems in terms of the workarounds that we all have to employ?
Shall I start, or do you want to? One of you want to go? I mean, my quick response would be, you kind of need all of them, because all of them give you very partial knowledge. I mean, just to raise the stakes on this, it's a really difficult problem, because even the baseline you would assume would be that Amazon also employs loads of scholars and scientists, right? And you think they talk to you. They have a science blog, and you think, this is science. The TSP problem is a science problem, right? We're scholars, we're humanities scholars, but we're scholars, and they would talk to us, you'd assume. And we've written to a few, and spoke to a colleague yesterday from Siegen who works on Alexa. He's written to dozens and dozens of them, and you always get the same response, which is, we've signed an NDA, and all we can tell you is what's already in the kind of in the Amazon PR announcement on the blog, and then that's the end of that conversation. So it's really like, even at that level, you would have thought that would be an obvious way to kind of backdoor to do what we do best, which is study what other scholars do and understand what they're doing. So that door is also shut, and I think that was probably very different earlier. But I think you need all. I mean, I don't really have. We've gained. This is the exciting thing from all of these things we've gathered. Really, pattern research. I think that, for example, we had a master student, Clara Friese, talking about kind of emotion recognition at Amazon. In voice assistants, and going through the patterns and what they write about what emotion means to them. Like, how else are you going to find that out? So like, you're right, we have this very big moving target, and we go at it from all different directions, but I didn't really like, there's not really a royal road. All of these workarounds, like, and it's still like, sometimes the pieces come together, sometimes it remains quite patchy, like with this question of like, do they follow the routing or not? So I don't really know. I don't know if the others two have a suggestion, but I don't really find that one of them will do.
I think the key is to accept that we're not going to open the black box, but we're working around it. So kind of thinking outside the box, quite literally in our case, outside of the Amazon box, is essential, and way less frustrating to try to kind of figure out what the insights are. So we've kind of embraced that feeling after, I don't know, 1.5 years of research, and said, okay, we're probably not going to have a very clear look inside. Let's see how we can manage around it. And, just going to the neighborhoods that, Amazon is operating in, trying to talk to as many people as we can, also on the streets have been, and kind of like focusing on the everyday life of these infrastructures and the logistics that we see has been extremely revealing and helping. And we're also very grateful for the people who wanted to talk to us. But what is tricky is to also protect these people as researchers, because we do have a big responsibility when we get interviews, and they have to be very careful. As Armin said, they're followed for talking to researchers, and they're very suspicious and all that out of understandable reasons. So it's kind of hard to paint that picture without threatened or without someone being threatened by our research. So that's always an important thing to keep in mind, considering ethics and all that.
Yeah. Eliza wrote in the chat, the cynicism problem for the average person means that a vast majority of citizens either don't know the extent to which these companies are endangering our lives and well-being, or don't care, have a kind of sense of resignation or nihilism. How can we work to realistically provide people with tools of resistance so that these conversations aren't just limited to academics, researchers, et cetera, who already agree with each other? And yeah, I think this is an important question. I note that we are almost at time, so I wanted to read that into the record. I don't know if any of you want to respond briefly to that.
I can, and just to point out, like, I mean, there's different things. Like the union's actually very good onto the job now, right? There's like a internationally organized kind of unions that are sticking together and plotting about how to deal with kind of the labor issue specifically. And the other thing that was important for our project was to bring this to the city to note that there's a terrain here that, where this stuff happens, where you can get active. So on the one hand, yesterday Maja-Lee organized this workshop where, we had 30 people talking about these technologies and how they impact our daily lives. So a lot of this is like, in the register, I don't know if you know things like the Tech Workers Collective and the work that Maja-Lee and her group do. This is like, on the ground education around these kinds of how this tech impacts, our smart homes, for example. But also the other way is talking to cities. I mean, this is the terrain, the city governments, these are one of, I don't know, in the US, in Germany, municipalism is kind of doing okay, and as kind of like there's lots of messiness, but also there's people to talk to, there's like democratic structures, and just pointing out that Amazon is an actor in remaking our cities and starting conversations about this with the city, with the municipalities. That's been somewhat refreshing. And that's where we're pushing a bit as well, because they have scope to deal with this, and they've noticed. They've all been kind of, I wouldn't say conned by Amazon, but they've given them all of these big spaces for their logistics fulfillment centers, and then they realize, well, there's very little jobs for the amount of space we're given, and now we have no space. They've taken up all the space. What do we do now? And on the labor question, but also otherwise, so they're kind of starting those conversations as well. And so that's also, and there's probably other spaces we could point to that, or that you could think of that are worth taking these conversations to.
Yeah. Lifting up activist work, Maja-Lee says, in an academic context is very important. Building alliances, which is, something that we hope the research network, continues to build connections between activists and organizers, again, thinking about that question of workarounds. Even if you weren't going into studying, some of these supply chain companies and processes from a kind of activist inclination, the resistance you encounter almost forces you in that direction, I think, as an academic, or at least that's my experience, not to put, words in your mouth. But I'd just like to thank you all again, since we are at time, exactly 1:30 here now, for that, truly wonderful presentation. I think, thinking about the context of your work against the previous presentation by Jess Beer and Jessica Steinman, I think it has all these thoughts in my head that I didn't get to ask about transparency and internal transparency versus external transparency, and how is Amazon a digital company that is applying digital methods in the physical world. There are all these, I think, interesting parallels that we can draw across our talk so far. So thank you again so much, panelists. And thank you, everyone who attended. We really appreciated it.